It was the kind of day that left your breath hanging in the air like ghosts reluctant to leave. Snow had blanketed Wintermoor overnight, soft and heavy, the kind that muffled sound and made the village look as if it had been dusted in powdered sugar. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, the occasional bark of a dog echoing off the pine-covered hills that wrapped the village like protective arms. At the far end of the main road, Elna Jensen was sweeping snow off the front step of her bakery when she first saw it. A shape, too large for a dog, too calm for a deer, emerged from the pines at the edge of the village. It moved slowly but with intent, like it had come not by mistake, but with a purpose. She paused mid-sweep, her fingers tightening on the broom handle as her eyes narrowed through the snowflakes. The creature stepped onto the cobbled square, the snow crunching softly beneath large paws. It was a wolf, not a mangy wildling, but something regal, something old. Its fur was the color of stone and winter dusk, gray streaked with pale silver, strong, lean, and quiet. Its amber eyes scanned the town, not with fear or hunger, but with something deeper, something searching. "Elna, get inside," her husband Henrik said sharply from the door. "That's no village mutt." But Elna didn't move. She couldn't. Her gaze was locked on the wolf, and she watched with stunned fascination as it padded right past the village well, past the town's iron lamppost, and up the sloped road toward the oldest house in Wintermoor. Old Jacob's place. No one called him Mr. Jakobsen anymore. He was simply Jakob, the man in the green coat, the one who hadn't stepped outside in over a year. And there at his door the wolf sat, just sat, as if it had come with one task and would wait for it to be fulfilled. By late afternoon, word had spread like wind through birch leaves. A wolf had walked into town. Not just wandered through, no. It had come, purposefully, and now sat on Jacob's porch like a stone statue carved from some forgotten myth. Children were shooed indoors. Hunters hovered near the edge of the village, but none dared raise a rifle. Not yet. "Strangest thing I ever saw," muttered Father Martin, arms crossed over his thick cassock as he stood beside Elna, who had long abandoned her baking. "It doesn't pace, doesn't snarl. I think it's waiting." "For what?" asked the mayor's wife. Father Martin didn't reply. No one had an answer. Even the dogs had gone silent, cowering in corners and under tables. The cats vanished. The birds stopped singing. The whole village, it seemed, held its breath. Jakob's house had once been the pride of the town. Warm lights, fresh cedar wood repairs, and a yard that bloomed with golden flowers in spring. But those days were long gone. The windows were always closed now, the garden overgrown with snow-choked weeds. The paint peeled in places, and the front steps groaned under the weight of age and neglect. And now on those old steps, a wolf waited. He didn't look toward the people watching from a distance, didn't flinch at footsteps, whispers, or the creak of the wind through the trees. He only stared at the door, unmoving, steady. As night fell, lanterns were lit along the village road. Shadows stretched across the cobblestones, long and curling. The wolf made no move to leave. "He'll freeze out there," someone muttered. "He doesn't care," another replied. Inside Jakob's house, no light stirred, no candle glowed, no curtain moved. The old man had not emerged, but the wolf stayed. By morning, the wolf remained where he had sat. Fresh snow dusted his back like ash on a dying hearth. He blinked slowly once, as the sun crept over the ridge. Elna left a small bowl of water near the fence line. She didn't dare go closer. The wolf ignored it. By midday, the mayor visited. He'd brought along Torvald, the village's aging hunter, to assess the threat. Torvald took one look at the animal and lowered his rifle. "That's no threat," he said quietly. "That's an oath." People began to bring food. Not meat, not scraps, but offerings. Bread wrapped in linen, chopped apples, even a few old leather toys left by curious children. The wolf accepted none. Only lifted his head occasionally, his ears twitching at the smallest creak or wind-rustled branch. And always, always he watched the door. The villagers no longer spoke in fear. They began to whisper in awe. On the third evening, Father Martin stood outside the church and called out into the wind, "Lord, if this is one of yours, let us understand." His voice echoed and faded. No answer came. But as he turned to go, the wolf looked at him. A single glance, and in that look was no malice, no warning, just a gravity that silenced the priest more than any thunder ever could. Jacob from inside.
He knew. He had felt it, even before the whispers at his door. Felt it in his bones like the ache of an old wound, like a song you thought you'd forgotten until the first note broke the silence. He sat by the window, unseen. And he watched the wolf sit in the snow. Eyes like twin lanterns of dusk. It couldn't be. And yet. It had to be. By the fourth day, the villagers no longer tiptoed past old Jacob's house, they stopped. They waited. They whispered. Children clung to their mothers' coats, wide-eyed. The older men removed their hats when they passed, though no one could quite say why. A silence had settled over the village, not just in sound, but in spirit. It was as if the presence of the wolf had pressed down gently on Wintermoor's shoulders, asking it not to speak too loudly. The wolf didn't snarl. He didn't move much at all. Only once, when a raven landed on the roof above Jacob's house, did he lift his head. He watched it for a long moment, then turned back toward the door. Henrik Jensen, the baker, had tried once to approach the house with a wrapped package of raw meat. The wolf had turned its head just slightly, not growling, but fixing Henrik with a gaze so calm and full of warning that the man stopped mid-step. "I don't think he's hungry," Henrik muttered as he backed away. "He's waiting," said Elna. "That's not the look of hunger. It's something else." The snow around the wolf had begun to form a shallow depression, the kind made when something refuses to move from its place. His breath came out in slow, steady puffs, misting in the cold air. His eyes were still, distant. Focused on a world no one else could see. Inside the house, Jacob hadn't moved from his chair by the darkened window. He hadn't lit the fire. The cold was creeping in, but he didn't care. He knew that shape. Even aged and scarred by time, he recognized the posture. The stillness. The grace. There were dreams that still visited him in the early hours of the morning, dreams of pine forests and quiet glades, of soft fur under his hand and the sound of padded paws running alongside him through the snow. He had buried those dreams. He had convinced himself they weren't real. That they were tricks of memory, nothing more. But now that shape waited on his porch like a memory made flesh. He whispered to the dark. "It can't be." The room didn't answer. The mayor called a meeting that evening in the town hall. Half the village packed into the warm wood-paneled room. The air was thick with unease and something else, reverence. "We can't have a wolf sitting in the middle of town for a week," he argued, gesturing broadly. "People are scared. The children are locked inside. This isn't normal." "It's not dangerous," Father Martin replied softly. "Have you seen its eyes? It's not here to harm." "We don't know why it's here at all," snapped the mayor. Elna raised her voice. "Maybe it's not about danger or fear. Maybe it's about waiting. Maybe someone should ask Jacob." A murmur passed through the room. But no one volunteered. Jacob was the kind of man people talked about, not talked to. A shadow on the edge of the village. The last to speak. The first to leave. "Maybe he wouldn't answer even if we did," someone said. Maybe. But the wolf remained. And that night, it snowed again. The fifth morning was clear and bitter. The sky a deep winter blue, clouds piled like ash on the horizon. Jacob stood by the window, his hand resting on the frost-glazed glass. He hadn't slept. The silence inside his house was broken only by the ticking of an old mantel clock that no longer kept accurate time. He looked down at the wolf. Still there. Still waiting. His voice broke into the quiet. "You came back." The words were raw. dry. He hadn't spoken them aloud to anyone in days. Maybe longer. I thought, it had to be a dream. The wolf's ears twitched. Jacob drew in a shuddering breath. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the cane that leaned against the wall. Each step toward the door felt like pushing through fog. Like walking across a memory that wasn't sure it wanted to be touched again. He hesitated with his hand on the doorknob. Then, slowly, the latch clicked. From across the street, young Thomas Berg saw the door open. His breath caught in his throat, and he called out without thinking. "Mama! He's coming out." Within minutes, the village square was lined with quiet figures, mothers clutching children, tradesmen in thick coats, and elders wrapped in woolen scarves. The wolf didn't turn toward them. He remained seated, eyes still on the door. Then it opened fully. Jacob stepped out. The cold wind met his face like an old friend. He closed his eyes briefly and breathed in. Pine, frost, and something else, something wilder. He looked at the wolf. And the wolf stood. Slowly, as if every muscle moved with meaning, the animal rose and padded toward the old man. Jacob's cane fell into the snow. He dropped to his knees with a groan. "Soren," he whispered. A name only the wind and the trees had known for years. The wolf stepped forward and pressed its head gently against the man's chest. Jacob's hand trembled as he reached out, resting it on the thick fur between Soren's ears. The old man wept, not from pain, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of something returned that he thought lost forever. Soren closed his eyes and stayed perfectly still. As though he had waited all these years just to feel this again. No one in the crowd moved. Not a word was spoken. Even the children were silent. They watched as the old man and the old wolf knelt in the snow, pressed against one another like the years had never passed at all. In that moment, it did not matter who Jacob had once been or what had kept him hidden for so long. The village saw him. And they saw the wolf. And somehow, they understood. The story moved through Wintermoor like mist through the forest, quiet, curling, and impossible to ignore. By mid-morning, everyone in the village had heard what happened. Jacob had come out. The wolf had leaned against him like a long-lost companion. And the old man, stoic, distant Jacob, had wept into its fur. The moment felt too big to explain, so most didn't try. They simply whispered it like a tale told around a fire. Jacob knew the wolf. He called it Soren. No, he didn't just know it. He loved it. And quietly, below all the chatter, grew something else. Respect. Jacob had returned inside shortly after the embrace, his legs weak beneath him. But Soren, if that truly was his name, had followed him, padding up the steps and slipping through the door like he'd always belonged there. The mayor wanted answers. So did the priest. But none dared knock. Instead, they waited. And while they waited, the questions grew. That afternoon, Elna brought soup to Jacob's porch. It was a habit she'd kept for years, leaving food when he didn't come to the market. But this time, she paused. On the step sat 2 bowls, her own, still steaming, and another. Licked clean. Her eyes widened. She didn't knock. She simply smiled and left the bowl where it was, returning home with more warmth in her chest than she'd felt in years. Up on the northern ridge, in a cabin barely standing, lived a man named Sten. He'd known Jacob longer than anyone else in Wintermoor. They'd hunted together when they were young, 2 boys with too much courage and not enough sense. When he heard the news, he took a long pull from his old pipe, stared into the fire, and muttered to the empty room. "Well, I'll be damned," he came back. The truth wasn't written in books or logs. It had never been spoken aloud to the townsfolk. But those who had been there, those who had seen Jacob before he faded into the background, knew the pieces. Jacob had always been different. While other boys snared rabbits or chased birds with slingshots, Jacob walked softly through the woods, listening. Watching. Learning. He didn't fear the forest. He respected it. And the forest, it seemed, respected him back. There had been stories even then. That Jacob could whistle and birds would come. That a fox once followed him for miles. That he could track an elk silently for hours and never take the shot. He hunted only when necessary. He spoke little, but when he did, it was with the weight of someone who didn't need many words. Then one winter, everything changed. It was over 30 years ago. A blizzard had struck the region, sudden and savage. 3 feet of snow fell in less than 2 days. Animals disappeared into their dens. Hunters stayed home. Jacob had gone out looking for firewood. What he returned with was not wood, but a bundle of gray fur wrapped in his coat. A pup. Barely old enough to stand. Its paws cracked and bleeding. Its ribs visible. Its eyes, pale amber. Most assumed he'd leave it at the ranger station. But he didn't. He brought it home. And raised it in secret. You can't do this, Sten had told him back then. It's wild, Jacob. It won't stay tame. Jacob had just looked at him and said, "It chose me." Sten had scoffed. But over the years, even he couldn't deny what he saw. The pup, who Jacob named Soren, grew into a powerful, breathtaking creature. Not a pet. Not a prisoner. Something, in between. Loyal to Jacob. Bound to him. They moved together like wind and branch. Slept beside the same fire. Fished the streams. Walked the snowy ridges. It wasn't until the incident that things unraveled. No one knew the details. Only that a neighboring hunter, drunk and foolish, had followed Jacob's trail and spotted the wolf beside him. Thinking it dangerous, the man raised his rifle. Soren reacted first. He didn't bite. Didn't maim. But he lunged, growling, a warning. The hunter fell. Broke his arm. Claimed Jacob had trained the beast to attack. Officials were sent. Papers filed. It didn't matter that the wolf had done nothing wrong. They told Jacob, release him, or they would take him. Jacob never said what it cost him. He took Soren deep into the woods. Farther than any trail. To a ridge that touched the sky. And let him go. No one saw Jacob for weeks after. When he returned, he was quieter than before. And he never spoke of the wolf again. Until now. That evening, Mara, the village teacher, stood in front of her students, all of whom were buzzing about the wolf. "Miss Mara," little Elsa asked, "why did he come back?" Mara paused. She didn't have a neat answer. But she knelt beside Elsa and said gently, "Sometimes, love remembers the way home, even if it takes years." The classroom fell silent. Outside the window, snow fell softly. And in the distance, a low, steady howl echoed through the trees. The days after Soren's return unfolded slowly, like thawing snow revealing old trails. Jacob didn't speak to anyone, but the light in his window stayed on longer. The chimney smoked again. And each morning, the wolf appeared in the yard, never straying far. Villagers passed with silent nods, casting respectful glances toward the house they used to avoid. Children stopped to listen for the sound of paws on packed snow. But Jacob remained within, choosing the company of memory and the presence of his silent companion over the world outside. For years, isolation had become his armor. After Soren was taken from his life, Jacob's world had grown smaller with each passing season. The warmth that once lived in his eyes flickered out slowly, not in a single moment, but with the soft cruelty of time. He had tried to forget. At first, he filled his days with chores. Repaired the roof. Painted the porch. Carved new handles for old tools. He told himself he was keeping busy, but it was a lie. He was filling a void he couldn't name. Nights were worse. Silence would wrap around his house like a second coat of snow, and Jacob would sit at the window with a cup of untouched tea, staring into the woods. Sometimes he imagined Soren was still out there. Other times, he feared the opposite, that his friend had long returned to the earth, bones resting under a bed of moss. What haunted him most wasn't the absence, it was not knowing. That bitter kind of hope that scrapes your ribs each time the wind howls just right. Every autumn, Jacob found himself stepping a little closer to the forest line, listening. And every winter, he turned away with heavier shoulders. Over time, the visits from villagers stopped. He didn't blame them. He didn't answer the door. Didn't wave through windows. The truth was, he no longer knew how to speak to people who hadn't known Soren, who hadn't seen what he'd seen. How could he explain what it was to have something wild trust you so deeply, only to be forced to let it go? The wolf hadn't just been an animal to him. Soren had been his companion, his anchor in a life filled with losses too deep to name. Jacob had never married again. He had no children. The few friends he once hunted with had either passed or moved away. Soren had been the last thread connecting him to a world that felt whole. One spring, maybe 7 years after Soren disappeared into the forest, Jacob heard a rustle at the edge of the woods. It was dusk, and the air carried that sweet, damp scent of thawing earth. For one heart-thudding moment, he believed, truly believed, that Soren had returned. He stepped outside, barefoot, ignoring the cold, and called out the name he hadn't spoken in years. But it was only a fox. It blinked at him with orange eyes and then darted off. Jacob returned to the house, locked the door, and didn't speak for 3 days. Isolation crept in like ivy through old stone. It wasn't sudden, it was slow. First, the days blurred. Then the meals lost taste. Then the calendar on the wall stopped being flipped. He'd forgotten birthdays. He'd stopped marking seasons. But he never stopped thinking of Soren. Not really. Even in dreams, the wolf came and went, sometimes bounding through forests, other times standing at a distance, watching but never approaching. Always silent. Always out of reach. Jacob once tried writing letters. Not to anyone, just to Soren. Pages and pages of ink stained with trembling hands. He wrote about the days they spent fishing by the river, about the time Soren chased off a bear twice his size, about the quiet way the wolf would rest his head on Jacob's boots by the fire. He never sent them anywhere. Just tucked them into a wooden box, which he placed on the shelf beside an old collar he never used but kept anyway. That box gathered dust for years. Until the day Soren returned. Jacob hadn't needed to open the door to know. He had felt it before he saw it. The way the air changed, the way the silence outside wasn't empty but full of something ancient, something remembered. When he had looked through the window and seen that gray body sitting on the porch, still and waiting, something inside him cracked open. Now, with the wolf resting beside the hearth again, curled on the same rug that had waited empty for over a decade, Jacob sat in his worn chair and watched the flames. "You came back," he murmured. His voice, rough from disuse, barely filled the room. Soren's ears twitched at the sound. "How did you know?" Jacob asked. "How did you find your way through all these years?" Soren didn't answer, of course. But Jacob felt something settle in his chest, a heaviness leaving. A breath released after too long held in. For the first time in years, he lit candles at dusk and didn't blow them out before the flame reached its end. He began to hum as he boiled water. He dusted the old photos on the mantel. He put on the kettle for tea and actually drank it. Outside, snow still fell. The village still watched. But inside Jacob's house, something long thought dead had stirred again. Not just memory. Hope. The forest had always been Jacob's second skin. Long before he became the man who watched the world from behind frosted windows, he was the boy who ran beneath pine canopies with bare feet and a carved walking stick, tracing deer trails like they were ancient runes. Even before Soren, the trees had whispered to him in ways no one else could hear. The forest wasn't just wilderness, it was language, rhythm, and memory stitched into bark and root. He remembered that spring with startling clarity, even all those years later. He hadn't gone into the woods expecting anything different that day, only to check a trapline near the base of Hollow Ridge. The air had been crisp but gentle, the snow retreating into soft puddles beneath ferns and moss. He'd been walking for hours, boots soaked, when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A whimper. Not loud. Not panicked. Just faint, tired, almost like breath. Jacob had paused mid-step, cocking his head toward a cluster of brambles where the snow lingered thickest. Something moved inside the thorns. Something small. He pushed the branches aside slowly, mindful not to make sudden noise. And there it was. A tiny wolf pup. Barely alive. Its fur was soaked through, matted with dried blood, and one eye was swollen shut. The ribs jutted out like the wooden slats of a broken fence. It didn't growl or flinch, it was too weak for that. It simply blinked once, and let out another soft cry. Jacob had crouched there for several minutes, the silence pulsing between them. A motherless pup, he thought. Abandoned or orphaned. Perhaps the rest of the litter had died. Or perhaps something worse had happened. He knew what he was supposed to do. Leave it. Let nature take its course. But nature had brought him here. He removed his coat, wrapped the fragile body inside, and carried it home. For days, the pup didn't move much. Jacob stayed up night after night with boiled broth, warm towels, and fingers crossed in silent prayers he never voiced out loud. He tucked it into a box lined with fleece near the fireplace and rubbed its back gently when its breathing grew shallow. "I don't know what to call you yet," he'd murmured in the dark. "But I think you're meant to stay." When the pup opened both eyes, pale, molten amber, Jacob knew. He named him Soren. Raising Soren was not easy. The laws of the land forbade keeping wild wolves. But Jacob lived on the edge of the forest, alone, and the people of Wintermoor respected his space. No one came uninvited. He told no one except for his closest friend, Sten. "I should take him to a sanctuary," Jacob had said once, holding Soren in his lap as the pup nuzzled into his beard. "And you'll never forgive yourself," Sten replied. "You found him. He chose to live." So Jacob built his life around the wolf. Soren grew fast. By the first snow, he was bounding through drifts taller than his shoulders, howling softly at the wind. He wasn't like a dog, Jacob never tried to tame him. There were no collars. No leashes. Soren came when he wanted to, and when he did, it was because he wanted to be close. Not because anyone told him to. He slept beside Jacob's bed but vanished into the woods at dawn. He returned most nights with burrs in his fur or the smell of pine needles thick on his coat. But always, without fail, he returned. They hunted together, moved through trees without speaking. Soren learned to walk behind Jacob, then beside him. Sometimes they stopped by the stream and sat for hours, just watching the water. Jacob started talking again, not to people, but to Soren. He told him stories, about the world, about pain, and Soren listened, eyes calm and steady. In the evenings, they would sit by the hearth. Jacob would cook something simple, soup, roasted root vegetables, a cut of meat when he had it. Soren would lie near the flames, tail thumping softly at the sound of Jacob's humming. Jacob hadn't smiled that much in years. Once, during the third year, Soren didn't return one evening. Jacob waited, heart tight. Morning came, and still nothing. He lit a fire, left food out, walked to the edge of the woods, and called. Nothing. By the third day, panic began to rise. Jacob packed a satchel, left a note on the door, and headed into the forest. He searched for hours. At twilight, he found Soren caught in an old poacher's snare, one meant for foxes or rabbits, clearly not strong enough to hold a full-grown wolf, but tangled tight enough around Soren's leg to cut into the skin. Jacob didn't speak. Just knelt, hands shaking, and carefully cut the wire. Soren licked his wrist once as he worked, whining softly. That night, Jacob carried him home on his back through 2 miles of frost. He never told anyone. But from then on, he checked the trails twice as often. Time passed. The seasons came and went. Jacob grew older. And Soren grew majestic. He wasn't like other wolves, tamer in some ways, wilder in others. He didn't fear humans, but he avoided them. He never barked. Never whined like a dog. His howls, when they came, were long and haunting, something deep and old in them. Jacob never grew tired of hearing it. But the world doesn't like when something wild gets too close to home. After the incident with the hunter, when Soren had only lunged to protect Jacob, the authorities made it clear, wild animals were not pets. The wolf had to go. Or they would come for him. Jacob begged. Reasoned. Offered to build a larger enclosure. They said no. And so, one early dawn, Jacob took Soren deep into the forest. Farther than they had ever gone. He built a fire. Cooked one last shared meal. And when Soren slept, he whispered, "Go. Before they come. I'm sorry, boy." He walked away without looking back. And Soren didn't follow. For weeks, Jacob waited. Hoped. He left food on the porch. Watched the tree line. But Soren never returned. Jacob folded into himself after that. The house grew quiet. The trail to the stream overgrew with weeds. He put away the walking stick. The laughter faded. But some nights, when the wind was right, he thought he heard a distant howl. And sometimes, the fire would flicker as if something old and unseen had brushed past the door. He never stopped hoping. But he never dared believe. Until the day the wolf returned. Jacob never needed words to understand Soren, and Soren never needed commands to stay. That was the nature of their bond, not built on obedience or training, but on something unspoken and ancient. In the earliest days, when the pup was still recovering, Jacob had taken to sitting on the floor beside the hearth for hours, simply letting the little wolf rest against his leg. He read aloud from old books, reciting stories to an audience who never replied, yet never left. As Soren grew stronger, his steps followed Jacob's shadow. He didn't need to be told where to go, he just knew. And Jacob, who had never been good with people, found that the silences between them were never empty. They were full of understanding, of presence, of a kind of listening that didn't require sound. There were rituals that became their way of living. Each morning, Jacob would whistle softly as he stepped out the door, and Soren would be waiting on the porch, tail tapping the wood like a metronome. They would trek together through the trees, checking on deer tracks or listening to the river's thaw. In winter, Jacob would warm 2 blankets, one for himself, the other draped over Soren when the wolf curled on the rug. And at night, before the fire dimmed, Jacob would whisper a single sentence, "We made it through another day." Sometimes, Soren would respond with a soft huff, a gentle sound that vibrated against Jacob's boots. The village began to notice. Once wary, they grew curious. Children pointed from behind trees, and adults whispered in taverns about the old woodsman and his strange companion. "They're like reflections," someone once said. One's a man shaped by silence, the other a silence shaped like a beast. Jacob ignored the stares. He hadn't chosen to make a statement. He had chosen companionship, and Soren had chosen to stay. That was enough. On stormy nights, when thunder cracked the sky and the roof creaked with the weight of wind, Soren would nudge Jacob's hand with his nose, asking wordlessly if everything was all right. Jacob would respond with a rub behind the ears, murmuring, "Still here, boy. Still here." And that would be all they needed. Other nights, Jacob would sit by the fire with a mug of tea, telling stories from long ago, about his mother's hands, about his father's axe, about the war he never fought in but lost friends to anyway. Soren would listen, head on his paws, eyes half closed, and Jacob would sometimes laugh bitterly and say, "You're a better listener than half the people I knew." In the quiet that followed, he didn't feel so alone. Once, in the thick of summer, Jacob fell ill. A fever gripped him, hot and relentless. For days, he drifted in and out of dreams, unable to rise. Soren stayed by his side the entire time, refusing to eat, refusing to leave. He fetched water with his mouth from the basin, dropping soaked cloths onto Jacob's chest, nudging them into place. When Jacob finally woke, weak and dazed, he found the wolf curled at his side, fur damp with sweat and melted snow. He reached out a trembling hand and whispered, "You stayed." Soren didn't answer, but Jacob knew he had heard it. They built something in those years. Not a home, exactly, not in the traditional sense. But a space where both of them could breathe. A space where neither had to explain why the world felt too loud, too fast, too full of edges. Jacob had once loved a woman, years ago. But she had wanted children, town life, noise, and normalcy. And he had only ever felt peace among trees and silence. When she left, he never tried again. Until Soren. One autumn, as leaves turned gold and amber, Jacob carved a figure into the wood of his cabin wall, a wolf and a man standing side by side, not touching, just existing together. Beneath it, he etched the words, "The ones who choose us without asking why." It was the closest he ever came to saying he loved the wolf. The villagers talked less and less about the oddity of it. Eventually, they accepted it. Jacob and the wolf became part of the village's rhythm, like the bell tower, like the old windmill. You didn't question their presence, you just knew they were part of the story. Then came the day of the shot. Jacob still heard it in his dreams, the crack of the rifle, the sound of Soren growling, not from rage but from fear. It wasn't Soren's fault. He had only protected his own. The hunter had stumbled, dropped his gun, cursed, but wasn't harmed beyond a bruise. Still, it was enough. The men came with paperwork, rules, and threats. "You can't keep a wild animal," they said. "He's not a pet," Jacob replied. "He's family." But they didn't understand. Or maybe they did, and it frightened them. A man and a wolf, it was too strange, too deep, too real. Jacob could have run. Could have fought. But Soren deserved better than to be hunted. So, with tears burning his eyes and fire choking his throat, he walked Soren deep into the forest. The wolf followed without hesitation, as always. They reached the high ridge, where the world looked endless. Jacob turned to him and said, "I need you to go now." Soren sat. "Please. I can't protect you anymore." Soren stayed. Jacob's voice cracked. "Don't make me say it." And still, the wolf didn't move. Jacob knelt, took Soren's face in his hands, and whispered, "You have to survive this, even if I don't." Finally, slowly, Soren stood. He looked at Jacob one last time, eyes full of something no man could name, and turned toward the trees. Jacob didn't watch him disappear. He couldn't. And for years after, he didn't speak Soren's name aloud. Not once. But he never stopped waiting. Jacob knew the forest better than most men know their own hearts. He knew which trees whispered first in the wind, which stones never held frost, and which creeks sang the loudest at dusk. And yet, when he walked Soren up to the high ridge that morning, the world felt unfamiliar, hostile even. Each step forward was a betrayal, each crunch of snow a reminder that he was leading his only companion into solitude. He had dressed warm, not because of the cold, but because he couldn't let himself feel too much at once. His coat was heavy. His boots were laced too tight. His heart was doing something strange. It was quiet. Not still, but quiet, like a song winding down to its final note. Soren padded beside him, unaware or perhaps unwilling to believe what this walk meant. The wolf was older now, in the prime of his strength, sleek and alert. He didn't bound like he used to, but his eyes were sharp, his posture regal. He was no longer the starving pup Jacob had found tangled in frost. He had become something majestic, and it was exactly that majesty that had made him a target. Jacob had argued with the officials for days. He showed them papers, photographs, even letters from people who had seen Soren living peacefully for years. But the incident with the hunter had changed everything. It didn't matter that the man hadn't been harmed. The law didn't care about intention, it only saw the wild. "You have 3 days to surrender the animal," they said, standing with cold eyes on Jacob's porch. "Or we come back with tranquilizers and cages." Jacob didn't answer them. He simply nodded once, shut the door, and didn't speak for the rest of the night. Soren had watched him closely, as if sensing the change in air, the sadness soaked into the walls. Jacob hadn't slept. Instead, he had packed a small satchel, filled it with meat, dried apples, and a blanket that still carried Soren's scent. He built the fire low that morning, placing a strip of venison on a plate, but his hands trembled. Soren didn't eat. He only sat beside Jacob and leaned his shoulder against his knee, offering warmth without asking for anything in return. And so they had walked, quietly, side by side. The ridge was farther than they had ever gone together. It sat at the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned into mist and the ground sloped gently into the vastness beyond. From up there, you could see the winding river and the scattered bones of the old lumber mill. You could see where the forest met the mountains. Jacob had chosen this spot because it was open, untouched, and hidden. He sat on a flat stone and patted the ground beside him. Soren came willingly, resting his weight against Jacob's hip. They sat that way for a long time. No wind. No birdsong. Just the slow breath of two creatures who knew they were nearing an ending. "I don't want to do this," Jacob said, voice hoarse. "You were the best part of my life. Do you know that? You made it bearable." Soren turned his head slightly. His amber eyes were calm, unwavering. Jacob swallowed. "I wish I could explain this to you. I wish I could make you understand it's not your fault." He reached into the satchel and took out the blanket, spreading it beside the stone. "They said if I don't let you go, they'll come. Guns. Traps. I can't. I won't let them take you." Soren blinked, then let out a soft breath, almost like a sigh. Jacob's voice broke. "You're not just a wolf. You're my brother. You're my son. You're all I had when the rest of the world went quiet." Soren leaned his head gently into Jacob's chest. Jacob wrapped his arms around him, buried his face into the thick fur, and let go. Tears fell freely, without shame, soaking into Soren's coat. When he finally pulled back, the sun was beginning to dip. He stood. "You need to go now." Soren didn't move. Jacob stepped back. "Please. If you stay, they'll come." Still, the wolf remained. Jacob clenched his fists. "Don't make me push you." His legs shook. His chest felt hollow. He turned away and began to walk, hoping Soren would follow, that maybe, just maybe, he could pretend this had never happened. But he didn't hear footsteps behind him. Jacob paused. Then he heard a sound, not paws crunching snow, not growls, but a long, low howl. Deep and echoing. It wasn't a goodbye. It was something older, a sound threaded with mourning and memory. Jacob didn't turn around. He couldn't. He walked until the howl faded. He walked until night swallowed the ridge. And when he reached home, he dropped the satchel by the fire, fell into the chair, and didn't sleep for 3 days. In the weeks that followed, Jacob stopped going to the village. He stopped speaking entirely. The house grew dim. Dust gathered in corners. The wolf-shaped space on the rug remained untouched, too sacred for boots or chairs. At night, he left the door cracked open, just slightly, and stared out into the trees. He didn't cry anymore. There was no one to cry to. Just silence. Once, in late summer, he thought he saw a gray shadow at the edge of the woods. Just for a second. But when he stepped outside, it was gone. He waited until sunrise. But nothing returned. That was the breaking point. Jacob stopped humming. He stopped tending the garden. He stopped carving the figurines he used to make for the market. When asked, people in the village said, he just disappeared inside himself. But no one understood what he had lost. Because he had lost more than a wolf. He had lost the one being who had looked at him with no expectations, no demands, just presence. He had lost the sound of padded paws crossing wooden floors at night. He had lost the deep, steady breathing beside the fire. He had lost the kind of love that doesn't require explanation. And in losing it, he forgot how to be seen. Jacob became a shadow, and the years passed like falling snow, slow, quiet, without notice. Until the day Soren returned. Jacob's world shrank to the size of his dimly lit room and the narrow view out of his frost-edged window, where each day merged indistinguishably with the next as he sank deeper into a solitude that had once been his sanctuary but now had become his prison. The days passed in a muted haze, each morning greeted only by the slow crawl of gray light and the whisper of winter winds against weathered wood. The vibrant pulse that had once accompanied his every step was now reduced to a faint heartbeat echoing in the silence. Memories of Soren, the once wild companion who had returned to him and then, against all hope, had disappeared again, haunted every corner of his mind. Jacob no longer went out, he rarely lifted his head from the threadbare armchair that had become his reluctant throne. His once steady hands trembled as they fumbled with brittle pages of a notebook filled with unsent letters, written in the soft scrawl of a man who had known more loss than comfort. The box containing relics of his past, the worn collar he had lovingly preserved, the faded photographs of a happier time, and tokens of small miracles shared with the wolf, sat undisturbed on a shelf, gathering dust like forgotten dreams. Each day, the village slowly moved on without him, whispers floating by his door about the old man who had retreated behind his walls, shutting himself away from the world that once revered and feared him in equal measure. The laughter of children, once a comforting reminder of life's continuity, now sounded distant and foreign. Every echo of the once familiar voices felt like a reminder of the profound loneliness that had settled over him. In quiet moments, Jacob would recall the sound of padded paws and the gentle warmth of Soren's breathing, a soft, steady rhythm that had once affirmed his existence and filled him with hope. He remembered the day he had been forced to let go, trudging into the forest with a heavy heart, watching as the wolf silhouette merged with a mass of trees until it vanished, leaving behind the memory of a promise made and a love unfulfilled. It was as if, in the shadowy depths of that forest, Jacob's own soul had been exiled, leaving him with a ceaseless hunger for that fleeting connection. In the solitude of his house, he replayed the final moments of that bitter separation like a broken record, the hesitant goodbye, the tremor in his voice, the silent plea in the wolf's amber eyes that seemed to say, "I must live, for both of us." Inner world became a landscape of barren memories and scattered hopes. The once vibrant forest outside his window had withered into a series of ghostly figures and memories, shadows of a time when every sound in nature offered solace. He would often reach out into the cold air, as if his hand could brush against the spirit of Soren even when the wolf was gone. There were nights when Jacob, stirred by the memory of a long-forgotten lullaby, would stand in the doorway and whisper into the dark, "Soren, are you there?" Only the echo of his own voice responded, mingling with the rustle of dead leaves and the creak of old wood. His mind would wander back to the days when he and the wolf had shared simple joys, when he had felt the thrill of a silent communion, when the smallest gesture had spoken volumes. Those were the times when the world had been imbued with meaning, when each breath was a promise of tomorrow. But now, the promise had faded into a gray uncertainty that matched the winter outside. Jacob's friends, those few who still dared to visit, found him unresponsive. He would sit through meals without tasting the food, his eyes lost in a distant gaze that did not meet theirs. They offered kind words and gentle advice, but he could not hear them through the thick fog of grief that enveloped him. Days bled into nights with little distinction, a clock ticked monotonously on the wall, its sound a harsh reminder of time slipping away, a time during which he had learned that the absence of what one loves can leave an indescribable void. Sometimes he would awaken suddenly from dreams of wild chases in sunlit clearings, and for a heart-stopping moment, he believed Soren was beside him again, a loyal presence that would bring him back to life. But the fragile hope would vanish with the morning light, leaving him more isolated than before. In his silent reveries, Jacob began to question whether he had ever truly been whole, or if he had simply been a vessel waiting for a love that time had cruelly stolen away. The memories of Soren gradually took on a spectral quality, a bittersweet echo of what had once been a real, tangible bond. In the stillness of that inner exile, Jacob confronted his deepest regret, the inability to hold on to something so wild and unbound. Every day, he felt that he was slowly erasing himself from the tapestry of life, leaving behind only a ghost of the man he once was. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming loss, there lingered within him a spark, a stubborn ember of hope that perhaps, one day, the wild might return to his door, that he might again hear the sound of paws, the familiar grunt of the wolf's breath, and the unspoken promise that love, however transient, never truly dies. The years of shadows had taught him that sometimes, the most profound connections are those that persist quietly in the recesses of memory, long after the voices have faded and the light has dimmed. In the deep silence of his seclusion, Jacob often wondered if the world outside continued to hold its breath in anticipation of a reunion that was as inevitable as it was impossible. And every so often, when a cool wind brushed across the barren landscape or a stray beam of sunlight caught the glint of something moving in the trees, he would catch a glimpse, a fleeting, heart-wrenching moment, that reminded him of the wild spirit he had once known so intimately. It was in those moments that Jacob clung to the belief that no matter how many years passed, some bonds remained eternal, woven into the very fabric of life, waiting for the day they would find their way back home. Jacob had grown used to silence, so used to it that when the first distant howl cut through the dusk air, he nearly dropped the tin cup he held between his weathered hands. It came low and far off, like a ghost slipping between trees, threaded with wind and memory. For a long moment, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on his aging ears. But then it came again, clearer this time, carrying a tone that vibrated deep within his bones. He froze, staring at the hearth, the embers casting a dull red glow across the room. His heart, long accustomed to beating in quiet surrender, quickened as though remembering its old rhythm. Slowly, Jacob stood, bracing a hand against the table to steady himself. His knees creaked beneath his weight as he made his way to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the snow. The village was quiet. Smoke curled from chimneys, lights blinked behind drawn curtains, and beyond the last row of houses, the forest stood wrapped in shadow. He listened. The howl came once more, closer now, and unmistakable. It wasn't the wild cry of a roaming pack or the clipped barks of a wandering dog, it was deeper, older, and achingly familiar. His breath caught in his throat. "Soren," he whispered, barely daring to say the name after all these years. He couldn't believe it, and yet every part of him wanted to. He stepped forward into the snow, moving slowly, eyes straining toward the tree line. The cold bit at his face, but he ignored it. Something was calling to him, not just with sound, but with memory. And then he saw it. A gray figure just at the edge of the woods, sitting silently in the shadows. The light from the village didn't quite reach that far, but Jacob would have known that silhouette anywhere. Broad shoulders, proud stance, head held just slightly askew. His knees nearly gave out. He took another step forward, and the figure didn't move. "Is it you?" he asked aloud, voice cracking. The wolf blinked once, as if answering. Jacob approached slowly, unsure if it was real or if his heart had finally conjured a mirage from the fog of longing. But then the wolf stood, took one step forward, and let out a low, soft chuff, a sound Jacob remembered from countless fireside nights. A greeting. A call between those who understood each other without words. Jacob's hand lifted instinctively, trembling as he reached out. He wasn't close enough to touch yet, but it didn't matter. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. The wolf, older now, with silver around the muzzle and a limp in one hind leg, took another step closer, eyes never leaving Jacob's face. In that moment, recognition passed between them like a spark leaping across dry leaves. Jacob dropped to his knees in the snow. "You came back," he breathed, the words breaking open something inside him that had been locked away for too long. The wolf padded forward the rest of the way and sat just in front of him. No sudden movements. No theatrics. Just presence. Jacob reached out again, and this time, his hand met fur. Coarse, cold, real. He choked back a sob and leaned his forehead against the wolf's, their breathing sinking like old songs remembered. "You remember me," Jacob whispered. The wolf's eyes closed for a heartbeat, then opened again, as if to say, "I never forgot." Time melted away. The years of separation, the bitter weight of regret, the thousand silent nights, all collapsed into this single moment of reunion. Jacob wrapped his arms around the creature's neck, careful not to squeeze too tightly, afraid it might still vanish. But the wolf stayed, leaning into the embrace. Around them, the snow fell softly. No one else witnessed it. No villagers peeked from windows. No one shouted or called. It was as if the world had agreed to give them this moment without interruption. When they finally pulled apart, Jacob laughed, a sound so rare it startled him. The wolf tilted its head. "Still as nosy as ever," Jacob said, wiping his eyes. "I've gotten older, you know. Slower. My knees don't like stairs anymore." The wolf snorted lightly, and Jacob swore it was amusement. "But I kept the fire going. Every night." He nodded toward his house, a glow still flickering through the window. "I always left a space for you." The wolf looked toward the village, ears flicking at the distant sound of a bell. Then, without prompting, it walked past Jacob, toward the house. Not running. Not sniffing nervously. Just walking, like it belonged. Jacob stood and followed, heart pounding with a cocktail of joy, disbelief, and something almost like fear. Fear that this might be a dream. That it might end. But when the wolf reached the porch and sat by the door, waiting patiently, Jacob knew it was real. He opened the door and stepped aside. "Well, don't just sit there," he murmured. "You remember where the hearth is." The wolf entered without hesitation, paws making no sound against the wooden floor. Jacob closed the door behind them. Inside, the fire crackled. The scent of pine smoke and old books hung in the air. The rug, untouched for years, still lay by the hearth, its edges frayed but familiar. The wolf crossed the room, circled once, then lay down exactly where he used to. Jacob remained by the door for a long moment, letting the scene wash over him like light through stained glass. Slowly, he moved to his chair and lowered himself into it. His body ached, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. They sat in silence, just like before. The fire danced. Outside, the snow fell. And within those four walls, time folded in on itself, bringing back warmth, companionship, and the kind of love that no years or distance could erase. Jacob leaned his head back and whispered, "Welcome home." Jacob didn't sleep that night. Not because he was restless or burdened with thoughts, but because he couldn't take his eyes off the figure sleeping by the hearth. The wolf lay curled tightly on the rug, tail tucked, eyes closed but ears flicking now and then at the crackling fire. Jacob sat in his old armchair with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his breath slow and deep, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had settled into his home like an answered prayer. He hadn't lit the lanterns. He hadn't made tea. He just watched and breathed and tried to believe that this was real. For so many years, this room had felt like a tomb, quiet and preserved, every corner saturated with the memory of Soren. The carved figure on the wall, the untouched rug, the hearth that flickered only out of habit. But now the silence had weight again. The fire's warmth had someone to reach. And Jacob, who had once grown used to shadows and silence, suddenly found it hard to sit still. He rose slowly from his chair and shuffled toward the hearth. Kneeling carefully, he reached out and let his fingers brush against Soren's fur. It was thicker now, coarser with age, and carried the scent of wind and wild pine. The wolf didn't stir, but a soft breath rumbled from deep in his chest, a sound Jacob remembered from 100 nights long gone. Jacob smiled and whispered, "You came back old and gray, just like me." He sat beside Soren on the floor, legs crossed like a child, back resting against the wall. He didn't talk much, just placed a hand on the wolf's side and let the rhythm of breathing guide him through the night. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't dream of howling. He simply slept. When morning came, the village awoke to smoke curling from Jacob's chimney and the faint sound of a man humming as he stirred porridge on the stove. Elna, passing with a basket of bread, thought she saw a shadow behind his window, a low, four-legged shape moving beside the fire. She paused for a long while, then walked on without knocking. Whatever had returned to Jacob's home, she thought, it belonged there. Inside, Jacob set 2 bowls on the floor, one with oats and apples, the other with bits of salted meat left over from winter stores. Soren approached slowly, limping slightly, but with bright eyes. Jacob watched him eat with tears pooling in his eyes but not falling. He only said, "You still chew like a prince." The wolf looked up once and then back to his food, chewing noisily, tail brushing the floor. Over the next days, something shifted in the old house. Jacob moved differently now, not fast, but with purpose. He swept the floor. He aired out the linens. He opened the windows during the day and let the wind in again. At night, he cooked soups with herbs he hadn't picked in years. He sang old songs, out of tune and softly, but he sang. Soren followed him from room to room, never too close, but always there, watching, breathing, warming the space like a living memory brought to life. One morning, Jacob stepped outside to chop wood, and when he looked back, he saw Soren sitting on the porch. Just like old times. He laughed, the sound dry and cracking from disuse. "Still supervising, huh?" he muttered. The wolf didn't move, just blinked slowly, as if nodding. That evening, as snow began to fall again, Jacob brought out the old wooden box, the one with Soren's fur, the carved talisman, and the letters he had written but never sent. He sat on the floor by the fire and began to read them aloud, one by one. Some were short, just single lines. Others rambled for pages, filled with sorrow, longing, and guilt. Soren listened quietly, sometimes resting his chin on Jacob's foot. Jacob's voice shook at times, but he didn't stop. Not until the last letter, the one he had written on the day he released Soren into the forest. That letter, he held with both hands, the paper yellowed and fragile. He read it slowly, every word a weight. "I let you go because I thought it would save you," he whispered. "But I never stopped hoping you'd come back. And now that you have, I don't know if I deserve it." He folded the letter, placed it back in the box, and then reached over and buried his face in Soren's fur. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I'm so sorry." The wolf didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stayed. That night, Jacob lit every candle in the house. Not for ceremony, but because he wanted the rooms to feel alive again. He walked through each corner with Soren trailing behind, naming memories like old photographs in his mind. Here's where you knocked over the stew pot. Here's where you chewed through my boots. This window, this one, you used to press your nose against when I came home late. And as he moved through the house, the emptiness that had once lived in the walls began to recede. The light didn't just reach the corners, it filled them. In the village, rumors began to swirl. Some said Jacob had finally gone mad. Others said the wolf was a ghost, come back to guide him to the end. But a few, the ones who remembered the bond between man and animal, simply said, the old wolf found his way back. Jacob didn't care what they thought. He only knew that each day now had shape, sound, and breath. Each night, he knelt beside the hearth, lit a fresh fire, and whispered, "Thank you for coming home." And the wolf, resting on the same rug he had once abandoned, would lift his head and let out a long, quiet exhale, the kind that meant, "I never left you." Jacob felt the days change in ways the sky didn't show. The snow still fell. The wind still moaned against the walls. But time had slowed, not in hours or minutes, but in the way moments stayed longer. Mornings didn't vanish like mist. Nights didn't hang as heavily as they used to. The air inside the house felt warmer, richer, even if the fire hadn't been stoked yet. Soren, though older now, brought with him something Jacob had almost forgotten how to hold: hope. He wasn't the same wolf who had once leapt through snowdrifts with wild abandon. He moved slower, rose stiffly, sometimes needed a moment to catch his breath after a short walk. But he was here. And his presence filled the spaces between Jacob's thoughts like music that never quite ended. They moved in rhythm again, like they had all those years ago. Jacob began marking the days on the kitchen wall. Not for tracking time, but to remember them. A short line for each sunrise they shared. Some lines had stars beside them, for days Soren howled softly in the evening, or when Jacob caught him watching the fire with the same eyes he'd had as a pup. Some lines had circles, for days Soren limped more than usual or refused breakfast. Jacob noticed everything, because now, nothing could be taken for granted. One afternoon, Jacob took out his father's old coat, the one he hadn't worn in a decade, and stitched the buttons back on. He packed a small bundle, 2 blankets, a pouch of jerky, a coil of rope, a carving knife. He didn't explain it aloud, but Soren seemed to understand. Jacob turned to him as he laid the pack near the door. "One more trip," he said. "Just you and me." That evening, they sat by the fire. Jacob's hands, though stiff with age, began to carve. A single piece of pine wood. He didn't draw first. He didn't sketch. He just carved, letting the shape come naturally. It took hours. When he finished, he placed it on the mantel. A wolf, sitting upright, tail curled beside its paws, its head slightly tilted, just like Soren when he listened to Jacob read. Jacob didn't say much about it, only glanced at Soren and smiled. "Felt right," he said. The next morning, Jacob woke early. The sky outside was still dark, but a full moon had laid a silver path across the snow. He made breakfast, 2 bowls, same as always, and dressed in silence. Soren was already awake, waiting at the door, tail flicking slowly. Jacob looked at him for a long moment, then knelt and whispered, "There's something I promised you. Something I never told you." He stood, picked up the pack, and opened the door. "Come on, boy. Let's go find it." The air was sharp with cold, but Jacob didn't shiver. They walked through the sleeping village without a sound. No windows lit. No footsteps. Just the crunch of snow under boots and paws. The trees greeted them like old friends, branches heavy with frost, bowing low. They walked for miles, slowly, resting when needed. Jacob guided them by instinct, by memory. Soren followed without hesitation. When they reached the foot of the ridge, the same one where they had said goodbye all those years ago. Jacob paused. "This is where I left you," he said, voice catching in his throat. "I thought I was doing the right thing. But it broke something I didn't know could break." Soren stood beside him, silent. Jacob knelt, placed the pack on the ground, and unwrapped the second blanket. Underneath it was a bundle of parchment, pages of letters Jacob had written since the day they parted. Hundreds of them. Some short, some rambling. He placed them on a flat rock, weighted them with stones. "I told you once I'd never forget you," he said. "That was my promise. But there's another part one never kept." He looked up at the sky, then down at Soren. "I promised you freedom. But I never really gave it. Not when I kept looking for you in every shadow. Not when I held on to the guilt so tightly it became part of my skin." Soren stepped forward, resting his muzzle gently against Jacob's knee. Jacob placed his hand over the wolf's head and whispered, "So now I give you what I couldn't before. My forgiveness. And my blessing." The wind stirred gently, rustling the trees around them. The moon had faded behind a veil of cloud, and a quiet snow had begun to fall again. Jacob stayed there a long while, speaking softly, telling stories of their time apart, of dreams, regrets, quiet meals, and the ache of an empty rug by the hearth. Soren listened, eyes half-lidded, body pressed close. As dusk approached, Jacob stood slowly, joints aching but heart light. "Let's go home," he said. "You'll rest by the fire. I'll cook your favorite. And we'll sit like we used to. No more goodbyes." Soren looked up at him with a tired but steady gaze. They made the journey back slower this time. The cold had deepened. The snow thickened. Jacob supported Soren when the wolf stumbled. Soren waited each time Jacob paused to catch his breath. It wasn't easy. But it was theirs. The bond, the thread that had stretched and frayed and nearly broken, held fast. When they reached the cottage, Jacob helped Soren onto the porch and opened the door. The fire was still burning. He lit the lanterns, warmed the stew, placed fresh water by the rug. Soren curled beside the fire, breathing slow and deep. Jacob sat beside him, one hand resting gently over the rise and fall of his ribs. He didn't speak. He just listened to the crackling fire, the hush of snow against the windows, and the quiet breathing of the one who had come home. That night, as the fire dimmed to embers, Jacob leaned down and whispered, "You kept your promise. You came back." And Soren, eyes still closed, let out a long, soft breath that seemed to say, "So did you." The days that followed were quieter than any Jacob had known, but not with the silence of sorrow, rather the kind of stillness that comes with knowing something sacred is drawing to a close. He rose each morning and found Soren still resting on the rug, his breaths shallow but steady. He would stir slowly, blink up at Jacob with the same eyes that had watched countless sunrises beside him, and wag his tail once. No more running. No more walks. Just presence. Jacob didn't leave the house anymore. He had no need. Everything that mattered was here, this room, this fire, this bond. He fed Soren by hand now, small bites of meat and broth that he cooled carefully before offering. The wolf ate slowly, as if savoring not just the food, but the act of being fed, the familiar warmth of Jacob's voice, the old stories retold in a hoarse whisper. And Jacob never rushed him. He spoke softly, sometimes just to keep the air full. About the first day they met, about how Soren used to nuzzle the corner of the firewood pile, about the walk to the ridge, about the long years in between. "I thought I lost you," Jacob said one night, voice cracking as he stirred the coals. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life listening for you in the trees. And then you walked back, like time hadn't touched you at all." Soren lifted his head at that, let out a soft breath, and rested his muzzle on Jacob's foot. Jacob slept by the hearth now, not out of obligation, but because it felt wrong to sleep anywhere else. He laid a blanket on the floor and curled beside Soren, hand resting gently on the wolf's side, listening to the slow, deliberate rhythm of each breath. He hadn't prayed in years, not since his mother died, but now he whispered simple things into the dark. Not asking. Just thanking. For each breath. Each day. Each moment borrowed back from time. One morning, Jacob awoke before the sun. The fire had died down to embers. Soren was still beside him, but something in the stillness was different. The air felt heavy, the quiet deep. Jacob sat up slowly and placed a hand on Soren's chest. It rose and fell, but barely. The breath beneath his palm was like a candle flickering at the end of its wick. Soren's eyes opened slowly, and Jacob leaned in close. "Hey there," he whispered. "You're all right. I'm right here." The wolf blinked once, then exhaled slowly, as if trying to answer with breath what he no longer had the strength to say. Jacob brushed a hand along his neck, over the old scars and silvered fur. "I know," he said. "I know." He didn't try to get help. Didn't run to fetch a vet or a neighbor. He understood this moment. Had seen it coming like the slow turn of winter toward spring. It wasn't a surprise. But knowing didn't soften the weight. He moved closer, curling beside the wolf like he had done every night since Soren returned. He placed his hand gently over Soren's paw, and for the longest time, he just sat there, his head resting against the wolf's shoulder. The room was filled with memories, the first howl that echoed through these walls, the quiet padding of paws across the floor, the flicker of firelight dancing in amber eyes. Jacob began to speak again, not loudly, just enough to fill the air. "You came back to say goodbye, didn't you?" he said. "You found your way home so I wouldn't have to wonder. So I wouldn't be alone." His voice caught, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. "I don't deserve that kind of love," he whispered. "But you gave it anyway." Soren let out one final breath, long, deep, and gentle, like wind through tall grass, and then he was still. Jacob didn't cry right away. He just sat there, his hand still on Soren's chest, waiting for a breath that didn't come. When it didn't, he leaned forward, kissed the top of the wolf's head, and closed his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "For everything." The fire cracked once, sending a spark into the dim room. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten, the edges of the world soft with the promise of morning. Jacob stood slowly. His body ached. His heart throbbed like a bruise. But his hands were steady. He moved with care, lifting Soren in the blanket he had returned in. The same one Jacob had wrapped him in the day they walked to the ridge, all those years ago. He stepped outside into the cold, breath fogging the air, and began the slow walk into the forest. The trees opened for him like they remembered the way. He walked until he found the clearing where they had said goodbye the first time. There, he laid Soren down gently and knelt beside him. He had brought no shovel, no tools. He didn't need to bury him. Soren belonged here, among the trees, under the open sky, where snow would fall and flowers would bloom and the wind would carry his name. Jacob sat with him until the sun rose, warming the tips of the pines, spilling gold over the blanket of snow. And then, finally, he stood, pressed a hand over his heart, and turned to walk home. The rug by the fire stayed empty from that day on, but the space no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a shrine, a place of memory, of love given and received, of a promise kept. Jacob still sat by the fire each night. Still cooked 2 bowls, though one stayed full. He still spoke aloud, because the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything they had shared. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind moved just right, he swore he heard it, a soft breath, a paw step, the echo of a loyal heart that had found its way home one last time. And this time, Jacob knew how to listen.